The war had officially ended, yet for many Japanese civilians scattered across the far-flung Pacific Islands, the idea of an ending felt meaningless. Yes, the bombers had stopped roaring overhead, and the thunder of naval shells no longer crashed against the shores, but the silence that followed was heavy, tense, and filled with fear rather than relief. For the women of a small village on Saipan, the thought of surrender brought a different terror altogether, one that had been fed and shaped by months of warnings and whispered stories. Rumors had drifted through the jungle long before the enemy arrived. Exhausted Japanese soldiers passing through the trees spoke in hushed, shaken voices, insisting that the Americans were merciless, that capture meant losing everything, that death was the only honorable path left. Propaganda posters plastered across walls repeated the same dark message. Mothers whispered to daughters that knives must be kept hidden in their sleeves. Grandmothers murmured that honor, once lost, could be reclaimed only through death. So when American patrols finally reached the village, the women hid together inside a collapsed storehouse, clutching their children tightly, every heart pounding with dread. These were ordinary women, wives of farmers, widows whose husbands had died far away, young daughters barely stepping into adulthood, and none of them knew what to expect. They trembled as the sounds outside grew louder, boots grinding against dirt, foreign voices giving sharp orders in a language they could not understand. The door creaked open slowly, letting a beam of sunlight spill into the dark interior. A tall figure filled the doorway, a US Marine with his helmet low, and a rifle resting casually on his shoulder. More soldiers stood behind him, spreading across the empty square. The women froze instantly, bodies pressed against the rough wooden wall, their eyes wide and unblinking, as though they could make themselves invisible through sheer will. The Marine spoke something in English, then repeated it louder. When no one responded, an interpreter stepped forward, and suddenly the message made sense. They were now prisoners, they would not be hurt, and they would receive food. But disbelief held them tightly. For so long, they had been told that the enemy would behave with cruelty, that surrender would lead to humiliation. Stepping outside, blinking against the bright sun, the women braced themselves. For the moment they had feared. Their kimonos were torn and dirty, their hair tangled from weeks of hiding. Babies cried weakly in their arms. Young children clung to their mothers, too tired to protest. Yet instead of the rough hands and harsh treatment they expected, the soldiers simply stood in a line with their rifles lowered. They did not move toward the women or reach out to them in any way. One soldier stepped forward, set down a bucket of water, and quickly retreated. Another placed a crate of food cans already opened on the ground and stepped back. The interpreter gestured and explained, telling them it was for them to eat. The women stared in confusion, wondering whether this was some twisted test. But after a long moment, one brave mother bent down, scooped water into a tin cup, and took a hesitant sip. Nothing happened. A young girl reached for a piece of bread. Still nothing, no shouting, no grab it, no punishment. Slowly, cautiously, hunger overcame fear. The women and children began to eat, their hands trembling as warm broth touched their lips for the first time in weeks. Bread softened on their tongues. Children slurped hungrily, cheeks bulging as if their bodies were afraid to believe the food was real. Mothers cried openly, tears falling into their bowls, as the soldiers remained at a respectful distance, watching quietly, but never approaching. When night fell, the Americans guided the women to a simple enclosure at the edge of the village. Blankets were handed out, folded neatly on the ground. Each woman accepted one, her heart tightened with dread, waiting for the moment when the soldiers would demand something in return. But that moment never came. Instead, the men took up positions around the perimeter, backs half turned, watching the surroundings rather than the women. Whispers moved through the group like a breeze. A young girl, barely 18, asked why the soldiers had not touched them, why the horrible things they had been warned about had not happened. Her mother shushed her, but the same question weighed heavily on every mind. Guilt mixed strangely with relief. Everything they had been taught told them the enemy would violate them without hesitation. Yet here they were, treated with the kind of distant politeness that left them confused and unsettled. An older woman named Sachiko held tightly to a small rosary, a hidden keepsake passed down from her Catholic grandmother, and murmured that perhaps the Americans behaved this way because their God was watching. Another woman, her face streaked with tears, insisted it must be a trick, and that something terrible would happen later. But days passed, and nothing changed. Each morning, the women received food. Water buckets were refilled. Blankets they returned were given back clean. Not once did a soldier cross the invisible boundary that separated the two groups. One evening, the women gathered around a small fire, trying to keep warm as the sky darkened. A Marine approached, but stopped several paces away. He lowered a sack onto the ground, stepped back, and waited. Inside the sack were brushes, soap, and cloths. The interpreter explained that these were for washing, meant for them to use. The women gasped softly. Some refused to reach for the items, too confused and ashamed to believe that the gifts were genuine. But eventually, one woman stepped forward, hands shaking, and picked up a brush, unsure whether this was kindness, strategy, or something she had no words for. She dipped the brush into the water and scrubbed her child's face until his skin showed a warm pink beneath the layers of dirt. The little boy laughed, a bright sound no one had heard in what felt like ages. The soldiers, seeing this moment, quietly turned their faces away to give the women privacy instead of watching them. That night, Sachiko took a scrap of cloth and used a piece of charcoal from the fire to write clumsy lines across the surface. We were ready to die. We believed they would take our honor from us. Instead, they gave us food and blankets, and they did not even lay a hand on us. I do not understand. Maybe I never will. What unsettled them most was not cruelty, it was the lack of it. In a time scarred by war and brutality, simple kindness felt more confusing than any threat. For these women, the first days as prisoners were not the nightmare they had been warned about, but a delicate, bewildering mercy that made them question everything they believed about enemies, war, and what survival truly meant. The march to the larger camp began at dawn. The women were told to form a line, children clinging to their sides, bundles tied with worn rope bouncing against their hips. Guards walked both ahead and behind, rifles resting in their arms, but never pointed. The women whispered anxiously among themselves, convinced that the brief safety they'd been shown would end as soon as they reached the main camp. Every step along the dusty road felt like a slow walk toward humiliation. Rumors darted through the group like frightened birds. There they will take us. There the officers will demand their payment. Mothers braced themselves. Daughters kept their eyes down. But when they reached the camp, what they saw only deepened their confusion. The place was not a dungeon or torture ground. It was a set of wooden barracks, tents arranged neatly, and a red cross station marked with a painted cross. Inside the fences, the prisoners were divided into groups, men in one area, women and children in another. Soldiers distributed supplies again, bags of rice, canned milk, even pieces of fruit. Children cried out in delight when they saw bananas, a treat they hadn't touched since before the war. Still, the women hesitated. Every kind gesture felt suspicious, like bait meant to lure them into lowering their guard. One mother whispered, "Wait, they will take it back when they take us." But nothing changed. The Americans gave food, then stepped aside. They offered soap, then turned away. They guided the women to the water pumps, but always kept a respectful distance, letting them wash without interruption or stares. Days melted into weeks, and still no hands reached toward them in the way they had feared. The absence of harm became its own strange burden, leaving them constantly waiting for a blow that never came. One afternoon, a medical officer entered the enclosure with two nurses beside him. Through the interpreter, he announced that they would check the health of the mothers and children, and anyone sick would receive medicine. The women froze in disbelief. Medical care from their enemies? Surely this had to be a trap. But the officer knelt beside a coughing girl, touched her gently, listened carefully to her breathing with his stethoscope, then handed the mother a small bottle of syrup. The mother bowed deeply, crying uncontrollably, unable to understand why kindness was coming from those she had been taught to fear. Sachiko, the older woman with the rosary, whispered softly that their own soldiers had told them to die rather than be taken alive. Yet here, the enemy seemed intent on keeping them alive instead. Another surprise came at dusk one evening. A soldier entered carrying sheets of paper and pencils. The interpreter announced that the prisoners could write letters to their families and that the Red Cross would send them. For a moment, the women stared in disbelief. Letters? The idea felt far too hopeful. They had assumed they would never speak to their families again. Slowly, almost shyly, they reached for the papers. Their hands trembled as they wrote messages filled with relief and fear. I am alive. Do not lose hope. We are prisoners, but unharmed. Some women wrote only names or dates. Others wrote short prayers or pleas. One young woman, Ko, bent over her page, tears falling onto the mark she made. She wrote to her mother in Nagasaki, I believed I would die in disgrace. But they have not touched me. They give us food. Maybe you will see my face again. The letters were gathered, folded with care, and placed inside a canvas bag. The women watched silently as the bag was carried away, uncertain whether their words would ever reach the people they loved. But even if the letters never arrived, writing them had loosened a tightness in their hearts, giving them a small sense of connection they thought they had lost forever. That night, under the weak glow of a lantern that flickered more than it shone, the women spoke in low voices. Some still insisted everything the Americans did was an act, a temporary show meant to mislead them before something terrible happened. Others, especially the younger ones, allowed themselves the tiniest spark of hope and whispered that maybe the enemy was not what they had been taught to fear. Ko sat with her knees pulled tight to her chest, speaking barely above a breath, saying she had spent her whole life terrified of men. Yet that night she had written a letter to her mother, a letter filled with more warmth and humanity than anything she had ever received from their own soldiers. The Americans continued acting in that same strange pattern of distance and self-control. Guards patrolled quietly, but they never entered the women's quarters without calling out first. When blankets became thin and frayed, new ones appeared. When children ran fevers or cried in the night, medicine arrived shortly after, always offered at arm's length, always with the same careful distance that made the women tense and relieved at the same time. This very lack of violation, this consistent respect, started eating away at everything they believed. For years they had been told the enemy was savage, ruled by cruelty and desire. Yet there they were, bodies untouched, dignity intact, their children cared for, their fears met with caution instead of abuse. Sachiko wrote again on her scrap of cloth, saying the biggest shock was not the presence of harm, but its complete absence. They had expected to lose their honor, but instead the Americans had, in their own quiet way, given them back the ability to speak and to be seen as human. Maybe this was what people meant when they talked about mercy. The question the women whispered to each other slowly began to change. It was no longer when will they hurt us, but why have they not? And in that emptiness, in that boundary, the soldiers refused to cross. The women began to recognize the guards as men worn down, tired, human. That realization unsettled them deeply. By late summer of 1945, word spread through the camps that Japan had surrendered. The news brought not joy, but a strange confusion. What would happen to them now? Would they be sent home or held indefinitely? The Americans gave no immediate explanations. Their routine stayed the same. Meals were provided on schedule. Doctors made their rounds, and the guards continued to look away politely whenever they passed the women. The weeks of captivity had left marks that could not be seen, the marks of disbelief, of long-held fear shifting into something the women could not easily name. At night, they whispered what no one dared acknowledge in the beginning, that they had remained untouched. No soldier had reached for them. No one had made demands. No shame had been forced upon them. It was the absence of cruelty that became the clearest memory. One morning, Ko, the young woman who had written home, received news through the Red Cross. Her letter had arrived. She unfolded the reply, and tears streamed down her cheeks as she read her mother's words filled with astonishment and relief. Her mother had believed her dead, and now thanked heaven for a miracle she had been too afraid to pray for. Ko held the paper against her heart as the women gathered around her, murmuring that if one letter had reached home, theirs had too. Sachiko, the elder, gathered several younger women as the sun set one evening. She reminded them of everything they had been taught, how they had been told to die before being captured, how they had been warned that the enemy would dishonor them, how every story had painted the Americans as predators waiting for the chance to take advantage of them. Yet none of that had happened. She told them the soldiers had given them food, guarded them, and returned to them the sense of worth they thought was already lost. Her voice held the weight of many years of fear, dissolving into disbelief. In September, word finally came that the women would be released. They were guided to boats that would take them back to Japan. They walked barefoot, holding small bundles of belongings, carrying items the Americans had allowed them to keep: a bar of soap, a sliver of cloth, a folded letter tucked close to their skin. Ko whispered to her sister that she was more afraid of returning home than she had been of staying in captivity, uncertain how their story would be received. The boat trip was quiet, filled with the scent of salt and the distant calls of seabirds. When the women stepped off onto Japanese soil, they were met with devastation: cities reduced to rubble, homes broken, families scattered. The women carried within them a story they barely knew how to tell. How could they explain that the enemy they had been raised to fear had treated them with dignity instead of disgrace? Many chose silence, afraid that others would accuse them of lying or collaborating. But in hidden diaries and whispered confessions to their daughters, the truth survived. Ko wrote in her diary that the Americans had not touched the women at all, and that was the greatest surprise. She had been taught to see them as monsters, but instead found war-weary men who chose not to cross the boundary that mattered most. She wrote she would carry that truth for the rest of her life. Sachiko told her granddaughter many years later that she had prayed with a rosary in her hand, asking to die before being dishonored, but when the soldiers arrived, they gave blankets and looked away respectfully. That was the moment she realized mercy could be more unsettling than cruelty, because it forced her to question everything she believed. Historians often speak of wars through statistics, battles, casualties, and destruction. But for these women, history was measured in silence: the silence of hands that never reached for them, of lines never crossed, of respect shown when they expected violence. As Japan rebuilt and peace returned, some of those women still held onto old Red Cross letters or memories of American guards who watched over them without intrusion. For them, the most unforgettable part of the war was not the suffering, but the restraint they had witnessed. It was not the violence that stayed with them the most,